Hey, good students, how are you? I hope everybody's doing okay in the midst of the COVID epidemic. I've been doing okay, and I've been looking at some of your papers and some of your grades, and they look really good. One of the things I wanted to say was uh, there's fruit flies in here. It's fruit fly season, anyway. Uh, Also, probably has to do with flies. I haven't bathed in about 4 days. I don't even know what day it is anymore. Just that tomorrow's trash day. Anyway, let's get back to business. Uh, First thing I want to say is I do not mind. I do not like the idea of getting emails from you all telling me that you were unable to upload things or that your computer wasn't working and you weren't able to get the exam to work. Uh, I don't like that. Okay, because most of these people that are doing that are doing it at like midnight, which means that you just run out of time. Okay, so please don't do that. Okay, it's rude and it insults my intelligence when you're telling me that you had problems with your computer, but the real problem was that you were late. The other thing is, I'm really sorry that my forehead is really shiny. But let me see if I can do something and maybe it'll work better. There, my forehead isn't that shiny anymore, and I can't see my gray hair anymore and all that. So let's get started. The next unit, now you can just see the glare on my glasses. I'll get it. Okay. Um, the next unit is civil rights, and what I'm going to give you right now is an overview of civil rights. Okay, I'm going to try and keep it under 10 minutes because when they're longer than 10 minutes, they just take a long time to upload. Maybe 12, 15. Anyway, we're going to cover civil rights, and what I do with civil rights is that I break it up, okay? Because automatically, if we were in class, I would ask you, tell me something about civil rights, and everybody would say Martin Luther King or the African American Civil Rights Movement. Which, of course, you're right. The importance of the African American Civil Rights Movement is the simple fact that they're the ones that started it. When people ask me, when do you think the civil rights movement began or the African American civil rights movement began? I always say that it began the day that a captured slave decided to take his own life by jumping off a ship uh, in order to keep himself from being kept in captivity for the rest of his life. Anytime that a slave decided to teach himself how to read or create music to decry slavery or come up with a dancing technique that really wasn't a dancing technique but was a martial arts like capoeira or something like that. So African Americans did not wake up one day and say, oh, it's 1965 or 1964 and let's start a civil rights movement. No, the African American civil rights movement started the minute they started catching African slaves out of the Bride of Africa. Okay. Now, it's significant because it's the first time that we see such a movement. I mean, really, what really brings the civil rights movement alive is television. Okay. I mean, the assassination of John F. Kennedy and you know uh, the bridge at Montgomery, Alabama, and you know all of these events where you saw policemen water cannoning African Americans and using dogs against African Americans and beating them with clubs. This brought them into the homes, and a lot of people said, "Look, let's face it." A lot of people would say, "Look, I really don't want to associate with African Americans, primarily because I don't know them and I wouldn't know how to. However, they should not be treated this way." Okay, and this is where it begins. People begin to question uh, the actual humanity of the United States. I mean, in my opinion, the United States got off on the wrong foot. They framed the Constitution and the Bill of Rights with the institution of slavery in it. And you just can't do that. I mean, you cannot say all men are created equal except women, except blacks, except Mexicans, except Chinese people. You can't have that in a democracy or in a democratic republic. It's got to be even across the board. You know what I mean? It can't be, well, this or that. So we are going to start, and I am going to start with a chronology of the African American civil rights movement. But then when African Americans started doing it, then Mexican Americans started saying, hey, well, why don't we do it? And then women were doing it. Of course, women were doing it since before Reconstruction. I mean, you have John Quincy, John Adams' wife, and Abigail Adams saying, you know, be kind to the women because we stayed behind during the Revolution. Okay, of course, then you're going to have the Native American, the American Indian movement, which is AIM. You're going to have the Mexican American civil rights movement, which is going to be actually two faceted. It's going to be the Chicano movement, and then you're also going to have, you know, what we call the LULACers, those Mexican Americans that chose to be part of the Mexican American movement, but would conduct their meetings in English, and that would start the meeting with a pledge. They weren't as militant. Later on, the Mexican American civil rights movement is going to fracture, and I'm going to explain that later. You're also going to have a fracture within the African American civil rights movement, where you're going to have people that are going to do peaceful protest, like Martin Luther King, and then you're going to have individuals like Stokely Carmichael that are going to spearhead the Black Power movement, and then later on the Black Panthers and stuff like that. So the civil rights movement is not a homogenous movement. It is actually pulling all in different directions. And one of the things that kills the Mexican American civil rights movement is their inability to agree with each other and the continued marginalization of women within the Mexican American civil rights movement. Uh, what happens with the Native American movement is the same thing, that some tribes would make deals and others won't. There's no homogeneity there. If there is any group that is homogenous, I will say this without reservation, it is the gay and lesbian, uh, 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 the gay rights movement. They were pretty cohesive, and their decisive moment is going to be, it's Stonewall, and I'll talk about that also. Now, a lot of students always tell me they hang their head in class and they say like, well, what about white people? What did they do? Did they contribute? Of course they did. Anglo-Americans were very, very active in the civil rights movement, okay? These kids went to college and they realized that they had been sheltered from the realities of life. I mean, we're going to have white students protest the bombing at Cambodia, um, and protest Vietnam, and they get shot. I mean, and they get shot on live television, okay? You're going to have individuals that help the African American civil rights movement that are white that are murdered. Okay, so but for the most part, it turns into a hippie movement. They are rejecting the values of the nuclear family. That's what a lot of white kids are doing, and they do it with drugs and they do it with music, the bra burnings, the burning of their draft cards, but it's still significant. Did it have a lasting impact? Not like the African American or the Mexican American or the gay and lesbian or the Native American Indian rights movement. No, not like that. But it was still there. We know it as the counterculture because it went against the culture. And of course, it was a heavy use of drugs. Why? Because they could afford it. you know. While most African Americans and Mexican Americans were using drugs, they were smoking weed. Whereas affluent white kids that could go to college could experiment and use psychedelic drugs and, of course, go to Woodstock and do all those other things that were not segregated. But for that much, we will say that they did participate in the sit ins, they did participate in the freedom rides, they did register a record amount of individuals to vote in predominantly African American communities. They did bring awareness to the things that were being done to brown people, and they did help promote the values, or not promote the values, but they did realize that their mothers were miserable. I mean, remember, at the beginning of the civil rights movement, we do not have an oral contraceptive. So the primary purpose of women at this time was to have one child after another after another. Remember, women were going to have sex as it was demanded from them, whether they liked it or not. In 1963, when Enovid is introduced, which is the first oral contraceptive, which was actually just a very strong birth control pill, women were ecstatic. Now I can control when I'm going to have a child. Now I can control my life. I don't have to worry about having a baseball team, as a family. The problem with Enovid was that they were using a sledgehammer to drive in a finishing nail, and the levels of estrogen that they were putting in birth control pills was ridiculously high. A lot of women then started to think that birth control pills were causing cancer, when in reality what was causing cancer was cancer of the cervix, because now women were having multiple sex partners, not just because of the pill. I'm pretty sure birth control pills did cause some cancer, but we all have to remember that cervical cancer is primarily caused by HPV, and HPV, you get it from having unprotected sex, and that's what happens. So the civil rights movement has music, has drugs, has sex, it has sorrow, it has tribulation. Now, another thing that we have to focus on the civil rights movement is 1968. And 1968, in my opinion, is the most important year of the 20th century. That's when the wheels came off. So when I come back, I'm going to give you a small little lecture on the African American movement. Then I'm going to give you a small snippet on the Brown Power movement or the Chicano movement. And then I'm going to give you a small snippet of the, Native American. I may condense these into two, and then we're going to talk about 1968. And 1968 is really defining. I was 3 years old, and I've asked my dad. I never asked my mom. I said, what was it like in 1968? And he would tell me, he said, it would just left a bad taste in my mouth. Kind of like when you put a penny in your mouth and then you take it out and you just have this horrible taste that you just can't get rid of, regardless of what you do. And I pretty much have decided that, the worst years of the 20th century, despite the fact of the Great Depression, I think, is between 1968 and 1972. It's just a period of cultural, um, economic melees, and just melees in general. I can't really remember. Then came 1976, which was the 200th anniversary of the bicentennial celebration, and that kind of made things better. But things still kind of drug along until Reagan came along. And once Reagan came along, he grabbed the podium and he made you feel like, yes, I feel good about being an American again. And I'm not saying that, that Carter was a bad president. I mean, he was an honest man, but he just inherited a cesspool that was left over from not just the Nixon administration, but it was a culmination of things that were happening. I'm not going to blame it all on Nixon either. I mean, Nixon did get us out of Vietnam after he bombed Cambodia, but there's a lot in this exam. And now I will tell you up front, Vietnam, we're going to visit it in the Cold War, like we have, and we're also going to visit it in the civil rights movement because it was pivotal in the civil rights movement. And by the way, there is a song that was very popular in the 80s that would go na 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 19 19 19, and it says that the average age of a American GI in Vietnam was 19, and that is not true, but I may put that song for you all to listen to. I believe that the average age of a GI in Vietnam was 23, which really doesn't make it any better, right? uh, with all that said, I'm at 15 minutes right now, and promise next time I won't say so much gibberish at the beginning or experiment with the lights because I kind of lost like 5 minutes there. But I want you all to stay healthy and you all take care of yourselves. Of course, if any of you are going through dire straits, that you're without food or anything like that, please contact me. If I cannot help you, I will put you in contact with somebody that can. Uh, I understand that these are trying times, but nobody should go to bed hungry in the most powerful country in the world. Students, take care, and I will see you in the next spiel. Bye bye. Gotta turn this off.